Our marriage began like a fairy tale, overflowing with passion, soul-deep connection, and beautiful dreams of building a life together. A decade ago, when we stood beneath that ancient oak tree, surrounded by everyone we loved, exchanging sacred vows that bound our hearts, I could never have imagined the nightmare that awaited us. Those first 5 years, they were pure magic. We explored the world together, chased our career dreams side by side, and held each other close through every triumph and every trial. We were unbreakable. Or so I thought. The transformation came slowly, creeping in like shadows at twilight, so subtle I barely noticed at first. It all started 3 years ago when she left for what seemed like an innocent weekend retreat with a colleague. But the woman who returned to me, she wasn't quite the same. Her eyes held a different light. Her words carried strange new meanings. Energy alignments. Spiritual awakenings. Terms I'd never heard her speak before. I told myself to be supportive. After all, everyone deserves the freedom to explore who they are, to discover what gives their life meaning. I genuinely believe that. What started innocently enough with meditation sessions and peaceful yoga practice soon spiraled into something far more consuming. Crystal healing. Expensive workshops that drained our savings. And finally, complete and utter devotion to a spiritual teacher, a man who had recently planted his flag downtown, building what he called a center of enlightenment. As she plunged deeper and deeper into this spiritual world, I felt her slipping away from me. Our intimate dinners, replaced by her evening sessions at the center. Our cherished weekend getaways, now solo spiritual retreats where I wasn't welcome. Every time I tried to voice my concerns about the ever-widening chasm between us, she would look at me with that distant, serene smile, one that didn't reach her eyes anymore, and tell me I simply needed to elevate my consciousness to understand the higher purpose she was pursuing. Last Tuesday evening, I desperately tried to salvage what we once had. I prepared her favorite meal with trembling hands, that pasta dish she adored, paired with the wine we'd discovered together during our magical trip to Italy. I set the table carefully, lit candles, hoping beyond hope to reconnect, to bridge the impossible gap that had torn us apart. She walked through the door 2 hours late. Her eyes were shining with an intensity that had become all too familiar after her gatherings at the center. My stomach dropped. I knew, even before a single word left her lips, that something monumental had shifted. "I've reached a new level of spiritual awareness today," she announced, her voice ethereal, detached, as she left her untouched plate sitting before her like a rejection of everything I'd tried to offer. "The Master has opened my eyes. He's helped me see that our physical attachments, they're holding back our spiritual evolution." I sat frozen, fork suspended in midair, my heart pounding as she continued to unravel everything we'd built together. The words that spilled from her mouth in the moments that followed would shatter our marriage into 1,000 pieces. Physical intimacy, she declared with chilling conviction, is merely a lower vibrational state. It keeps souls chained to earthly desires. A celibate marriage, that is our spiritual path forward now. The Master believes I'm ready for this next phase of transcendence, and you. She paused, her gaze boring into mine, you should embrace it too. The request hung in the air between us like an impenetrable wall of ice. 10 years of marriage. 10 years of building dreams, sharing secrets, creating a life woven together with love and sacrifice. And now, she was unilaterally tearing it all apart, deciding without me that physical intimacy, that most sacred expression of our bond, was no longer part of our relationship. My mind reeled. "Is this truly what you want?" I asked, my voice barely steady, carefully choosing each word. "Or is this what your spiritual teacher is telling you to want?" Her expression hardened instantly, transforming into something cold and unrecognizable. "You've always been skeptical," she snapped. "This is exactly why you're stuck in lower consciousness. The Master has special insight into spiritual advancement. He's guiding several couples through this purification process." That detail struck me like lightning. "Other couples are doing this too?" "Yes," she replied, her tone dripping with condescension, as if I was failing some cosmic test. "Those who are truly committed to spiritual growth. The Master says the couples who succeed will experience spiritual union far more profound than any physical connection." Every instinct in my body screamed that something was deeply, terribly wrong. But I fought to remain open-minded. "Can we please discuss this with a marriage counselor?" Someone who understands both relationships and spiritual practices. She dismissed my plea immediately, waving it away like an annoying insect. Conventional counselors operate at the level of ego. We need to transcend, not analyze. That night, she moved her belongings into the guest bedroom. The sound of her footsteps echoing through our home felt like a funeral procession for our marriage. As I lay alone in our bed, the sheets still carrying her faint scent, I replayed everything in my mind, desperately searching for the moment where I could have prevented this. When had our relationship started heading toward this devastating ultimatum? Sleep refused to come. Questions tormented me through the endless darkness. Was this genuine spiritual exploration, or something far more sinister? Who was this master who wielded such terrifying power over my wife's mind and heart? And the question that broke me most, was I willing to accept a marriage that had been fundamentally redefined without my consent? Without my voice? When morning finally arrived, it brought no answers, no relief. Only the gut-wrenching realization that the woman sleeping just one room away had become a complete stranger to me. I had to understand what was really happening. Both with my wife and with the spiritual group that seemed to be rewriting the very rules of our sacred union. The following weeks dragged by in agonizing tension, every conversation strained and painful. Despite the alarm bells ringing in my mind, I made a conscious decision to approach this nightmare with an open heart. Perhaps, I told myself, if I could understand her spiritual journey, I could finally grasp what was destroying our marriage from the inside out. I dove into research about the group she'd joined, scouring the internet for answers. All I found was a polished, sleek website overflowing with empty promises of enlightenment and glowing testimonials from devoted followers who all sounded eerily similar. When I gathered the courage to suggest attending one of their sessions with her, expecting immediate resistance, she surprised me by agreeing. The master welcomes seekers at all levels, she said with that same haunting, serene smile that no longer felt like hers. That Friday evening found me sitting cross-legged on a hard floor in a converted warehouse downtown, surrounded by approximately 30 people, all wearing the same intense, almost trance-like gaze I'd seen consuming my wife. The room fell into an oppressive silence as a man in his mid-50s made his entrance, draped in flowing white linen like some kind of prophet. This was him. The master. A former investment banker who claimed to have experienced a profound spiritual awakening during a vacation in Sedona 5 years ago. He spoke for nearly 2 excruciating hours about transcending physical desires, about elevating consciousness through detachment. Some of what he said seemed harmless enough, even reasonable. But I couldn't ignore the pattern. The way his teachings kept circling back obsessively to relationships and physical intimacy as lower vibrations that must be conquered and overcome. What disturbed me most, what made my skin crawl, was the way his eyes kept finding my wife in the audience, lingering on her just a fraction too long, with an intensity that felt anything but spiritual. When the formal session finally ended, followers swarmed toward him like moths to a flame, desperate for private words. I watched in growing unease as my wife waited patiently in line for her turn, then leaned in close, whispering something that made him place his hand on her shoulder with a familiarity that made my blood run cold. He has special insight into my spiritual journey, she explained during our silent, tension-filled drive home. He believes I'm progressing faster than most. The next morning, I suggested breakfast at our favorite cafe, a desperate peace offering, one final attempt to reconnect with the woman I'd married. As we sat across from each other, steam rising from coffee neither of us touched, I carefully, gently broached the subject burning through my mind. I'm trying so hard to understand your spiritual journey, I began, my voice thick with emotion. But I'm terrified about how it's destroying our relationship. Marriage should be a partnership where major decisions are made together, as equals. Her expression transformed immediately, hardening into stone. This isn't a major decision. It's spiritual evolution. You're still trapped, thinking at the level of physical attachment. Can we at least talk about what intimacy means beyond just the physical? I pleaded. Emotional connection. Making decisions together. Supporting each other's growth through life's challenges. Those are still attachments, she replied coldly, dismissively. The master says attachment of any kind prevents true spiritual liberation. And yet, I observed carefully, my heart breaking, you seem profoundly attached to the master's teachings. The flash of pure anger in her eyes was instantaneous and fierce. You're being deliberately obtuse. This is exactly why we're at different levels. That evening, I noticed her obsessively checking her phone, her face lighting up with secret smiles before she quickly hid the screen whenever I entered the room. My stomach twisted with a dread I'd never experienced before in our marriage. While she was in the shower, I did something that went against every principle I held sacred. Something I never imagined I would do. I checked her phone. What I discovered sent a wave of ice-cold horror through my entire body. Dozens upon dozens of messages between her and the master. Exchanges that were far, far too intimate for any legitimate spiritual guidance. While not explicitly romantic, they overflowed with special attention, private jokes, and late-night philosophical discussions that had once belonged to our sacred space. Most disturbing was his relentless reinforcement of her specialness, how quickly she was advancing, how she needed to release all the attachments holding her back. The subtext was unmistakable. When I confronted her, she exploded in righteous indignation. "You invaded my privacy. This only proves you're operating from jealousy and fear, the lowest emotions possible. It confirms you're not ready for spiritual advancement." "This isn't about spiritual advancement," I shot back, struggling desperately to keep my voice from shaking. "It's about honesty and respect in our relationship. You're demanding a celibate marriage while simultaneously developing an increasingly intimate, emotional affair with another man. You're completely misinterpreting everything," she insisted, her voice rising. "The master connects deeply with all his students. Do all his students receive midnight messages about their luminous souls?" I asked, my voice breaking. The conversation collapsed from there, ending with her locking herself away in the guest room, shutting me out completely. That night, I lay in the suffocating darkness, unable to comprehend how the person I had known so intimately for an entire decade could transform into someone utterly unrecognizable in mere months. The next day, with grim determination, I decided to dig deeper into this spiritual group and its dangerously charismatic leader. What I was about to discover would force me to make decisions I never, in my darkest nightmares, thought I'd face in our marriage. My investigation began in deadly earnest. A simple online search revealed frustratingly little beyond their carefully crafted website and meticulously curated social media presence. I needed real, substantial information. So I took a day off work and positioned myself in a coffee shop directly across from their center, becoming a silent observer of the constant comings and goings. What immediately struck me was the unmistakable demographic pattern. Predominantly women in their 30s and 40s, many arriving in expensive luxury cars, wearing designer clothing, clearly successful and educated. During my surveillance, I noticed one woman leaving the center with a deeply troubled expression etched across her face. Something about her demeanor, so dramatically different from the serene, blank masks worn by all the other followers, captured my attention. I approached her carefully, gently introducing myself and explaining my situation in deliberately vague terms. Her initial suspicion melted into sudden recognition as I described the celibate marriage as spiritual path doctrine. "They got to your wife too," she said, her eyes darting nervously back toward the center, as if afraid of being watched. "My sister fell for the exact same teaching 3 months ago. Her husband is absolutely devastated." We quickly moved to a quieter, more private location where she poured out her sister's story, and it was like listening to my own nightmare reflected back at me. The spiritual abstinence requirement. The escalating devotion to the master. The inappropriate late-night messaging. Her brother-in-law had finally filed for divorce just last month after uncovering the ultimate, crushing hypocrisy. "The whole, transcending physical desire thing," she explained bitterly, her voice trembling with rage. "It's selective. Once the marriages break down and crumble, the master swoops in to console the spiritual widows. 3 women from the inner circle are now in intimate, romantic relationships with him. All of them after their marriages conveniently failed due to spiritual incompatibility." She pressed her contact information and the names of 2 former members into my hand. As we prepared to part ways, she gripped my arm with unexpected, almost painful intensity. "These groups don't just take your spouse," she warned, her voice dropping to an urgent whisper. "They take your money, your self-worth, your entire identity. Everything. Please, be careful." Armed with this devastating information, I returned home, my resolve hardening. I was determined to have one more real conversation with my wife. I found her in our garden, meditating serenely on the stone bench we had lovingly chosen together years ago when life was simple and beautiful. When she opened her eyes, for just one fleeting, precious moment, I glimpsed the person I had fallen desperately in love with before that serene, impenetrable mask slid back into place. "We need to talk," I began as carefully as I could manage, my voice tight with controlled emotion. "I've learned some deeply concerning things about your spiritual group." "You mean you've been listening to apostates and bitter critics?" she replied with instant dismissiveness. "The master warned us that detractors would spread vicious misinformation." "Is it misinformation?" I pressed, my heart pounding, "that 3 women in the group began romantic relationships with the master immediately after their marriages ended? All marriages that ended specifically because of the same teaching he's now imposing on ours." Her expression flickered with something, surprise, maybe doubt, but it was quickly, violently replaced by defensive anger. "You're deliberately twisting things to fit your narrative. Those women found spiritual partners after being freed from lower vibration marriages. And it's just pure coincidence," I said, my voice heavy with sarcasm and pain, "that their spiritual partner happens to be the exact same men who told them to end physical intimacy with their husbands." "You're being deliberately obtuse," she snapped, jumping to her feet. "The master has transcended ordinary relationship paradigms. His connections with students operate at a higher level you clearly cannot and will not understand." The conversation spiraled violently from there. Every single piece of evidence I desperately presented was deflected with impenetrable spiritual jargon or vicious accusations about my lower consciousness. When I brought up the inappropriate late-night messages, she accused me of invading her privacy again. When I questioned the substantial enlightenment donations hemorrhaging from our credit card statement, she claimed that spiritual growth required material investment. That evening, while she attended yet another session, I contacted one of the former members whose information I'd been given. The video call revealed a man roughly my age, but his eyes held the haunted, traumatized expression of someone still desperately trying to process deep psychological wounds. "My wife and I were members for 18 months, he explained, his voice hollow. "The progression is always identical. First, it's just innocent meditation and harmless philosophy. Then comes the calculated separation. Physical abstinence from your spouse, while simultaneously the master becomes increasingly intimate with one partner. Usually the wife. Always the wife." His voice cracked. By the time I finally realized what was happening, she had already transferred nearly $40,000 to the group's Ascension Fund and filed for divorce. "Did you try to show her evidence of what was happening?" I asked desperately. His bitter, broken laugh said everything. "Evidence doesn't work against faith. Logic doesn't work against manipulated emotion. The master creates a complete alternate reality where everything supports his narrative perfectly. If you question it, you're spiritually deficient. If you present evidence, you're persecuting them. You can't win." After the call ended, I sat alone in our darkened living room, surrounded by wedding photos and precious mementos from happier times, from a life that felt like it belonged to different people entirely. The woman who had shared those beautiful moments was still physically present in our home, sleeping just rooms away. But she was absent in every single way that actually mattered. I was losing her to what appeared to be nothing more than an elaborately calculated scheme, a trap designed to destroy everything we'd built. And my increasingly desperate efforts to reach her only seemed to push her further and further away into his waiting arms. When she finally returned late that night, I was still sitting motionless in the suffocating darkness. She paused in the doorway, backlit by the harsh hallway light, appearing like a ghostly specter of the woman I had once married. "We can't continue like this," I said quietly into the darkness, my voice heavy with exhaustion and despair. "Something has to change." Her response would determine absolutely everything that followed. Our future. Our past. Everything we had ever been. Her response that night was both heartbreakingly predictable and utterly devastating. "You're absolutely right," she said coldly. "Something has to change. Your resistance to spiritual growth. The master says your negative energy is becoming a serious obstacle to my ascension." Then she delivered her ultimatum, sharp and final as a blade. Either I join the spiritual path completely, embracing every aspect including the crushing financial commitments and total acceptance of her radically new lifestyle, or she would need to reevaluate our karmic contract. The clinical, detached coldness in her voice as she reduced our decade-long marriage to a karmic contract sent an icy chill straight through to my bones. This wasn't about differing spiritual beliefs anymore. This was about the complete and total dismantling of the sacred partnership we had spent 10 years carefully building together, brick by precious brick. Sleep became impossible that night as I wrestled with my agonizing options. By morning, exhausted but clear-minded, I had made my decision. I would fight for her with everything I had. But I also needed to protect myself, to prepare for the very real possibility of losing her entirely, forever. My first call was to a trusted friend who happened to be a family lawyer. Without committing to anything irreversible, I desperately sought advice on how to protect myself financially while still clinging to hope for reconciliation. The conversation was brutally sobering. Apparently, I wasn't even the first person to call him about a spouse ensnared by this particular group. Document everything, he advised grimly. Financial transactions, behavioral changes, every single communication with the group leader. Hope for the absolute best, but prepare yourself for the worst. Next, I reached out to a counselor who specialized in helping families torn apart by high-control groups. She couldn't discuss specific cases due to confidentiality, but she confirmed with chilling certainty that the pattern I described was devastatingly consistent with what she'd witnessed countless times in her practice. What you're experiencing, she explained gently but firmly, is a sophisticated form of emotional and spiritual manipulation. These groups deliberately target people during vulnerable periods in their lives and gradually, systematically replace all their existing relationships with absolute devotion to the group and its leader. How can I reach her? I asked, unable to hide the raw desperation in my voice. She dismisses absolutely everything I say as spiritual ignorance. The direct approach rarely, if ever, works, she cautioned. Direct confrontation only reinforces their belief that outsiders fundamentally don't understand their enlightened path. Instead, focus on maintaining emotional connection without directly challenging her beliefs. Ask thoughtful questions that gently prompt critical thinking rather than making declarative statements she can easily reject and dismiss. Armed with this crucial guidance, I completely adjusted my approach. Rather than presenting damning evidence or engaging in futile arguments, I began asking gentle, carefully crafted questions whenever precious opportunities arose. What specific aspects of this teaching resonate most deeply with you? Or, how do you genuinely feel when you're at the center versus when you're here at home with me? These questions occasionally, miraculously, created brief moments of genuine connection. Fleeting glimpses of the extraordinary woman I had married shining through the facade. During one such vulnerable conversation, she mentioned feeling unexpectedly uncertain about a new financial commitment the master had introduced, a $5,000 purification retreat, supposedly required for advancing to the next spiritual level. I resisted every urge to point out the glaringly obvious exploitation. Instead, I simply asked, what specific, concrete benefits do you hope to gain from this significant investment? Her struggle to articulate any genuine, concrete outcomes created a small but visible crack in her previously unshakable certainty. Meanwhile, I continued quietly building a network of people who truly understood the nightmare we were facing. Through the former members I'd contacted, I discovered an invaluable online support group for partners and family members of people trapped in similar groups. Their stories mirrored mine with absolutely eerie precision. The identical progression. The identical teachings. Often even the exact same phrases robotically repeated by their captured loved ones, word for word. 3 long, agonizing months into this careful, calculated campaign, I began noticing subtle but meaningful shifts. My wife occasionally declined evening sessions at the center to share dinner at home with me. Sometimes she would spontaneously reminisce about our early years together, her voice soft with genuine nostalgia. These precious moments gave me fragile hope, though they were constantly interspersed with periods of intensified, almost frantic devotion following her one-on-one sessions with the master. The turning point arrived completely unexpectedly. While reorganizing our home office, a task she had suddenly, uncharacteristically volunteered for, my wife discovered a detailed journal I had been keeping about our entire situation. I hadn't deliberately hidden it, believing transparency and honesty were fundamentally important. But I also hadn't expected her to actually read it. The journal contained everything. My raw, unfiltered emotions. My extensive research findings about the group. Heartbreaking accounts from former members. All of it laid bare. I arrived home to find her sitting completely motionless at the kitchen table, my journal spread open before her like evidence at a trial. I braced myself for explosive anger, bitter accusations, perhaps even an immediate, devastating demand for divorce. Instead, I found her quietly weeping, tears streaming silently down her face. "Is this really how you see what's happening?" she asked, her voice small, broken, utterly uncertain in a way I hadn't heard in months. "It's how I've experienced it." I answered as carefully as humanly possible, my own voice thick with emotion. "I've been slowly, painfully losing the person I love more than anything to someone who seems to have absolute, terrifying influence over your thoughts, your decisions, your very soul." For the first time in months, we had a real conversation. An honest conversation completely unburdened by impenetrable spiritual jargon or defensive, hostile posturing. She admitted to serious doubts she'd been desperately suppressing about certain teachings and practices. She revealed, her voice shaking, that the master had become increasingly insistent about private counseling sessions and had recently suggested she might need to permanently leave her spiritually stagnant marriage to progress further on her path. This moment of clarity was incredibly fragile, delicate as spun glass. I could almost see the competing narratives violently battling within her mind, fighting for control of her reality. The programming of months, the systematic brainwashing, wasn't going to simply vanish in one conversation. But something fundamental had shifted. Something had broken through. She agreed to take a 2-week complete break from the center to gain desperately needed perspective. The longest she'd been away since first joining. Those 2 weeks were like walking on razor-sharp eggshells, every moment precarious and terrifying. I maintained an impossibly delicate balance between supportive presence and respectful distance, absolutely terrified of saying even one wrong word that might send her fleeing back to the false certainty the group had offered. As the days slowly passed, more and more of the woman I had married began to resurface, like someone emerging from deep water. We cooked together. We watched movies together. We even laughed together, genuine laughter, sounds that had become completely foreign in our home, echoing through rooms that had been silent for far too long. Then came the text message that threatened to destroy everything we had so carefully, painfully begun to rebuild. Everything hung in the balance once more. The text message shattered our peaceful dinner like a bomb detonating, arriving during a rare, precious moment we were finally sharing after weeks of unbearable tension. Her phone chimed with that distinctive, triggering tone she had set specifically for communications from the center. I watched helplessly as her entire expression shifted in a split second from relaxed and genuine to conflicted and anxious. "The master is concerned about my spiritual regression," she said, her voice distant again, staring at the glowing screen as if hypnotized. "He's requesting an emergency purification session. Tonight. Right now." The timing was far, far too perfect to be mere coincidence. Somehow, through some mechanism I couldn't understand, he had sensed her pulling away from his control and was now desperately, aggressively reasserting his dominance over her. This was the absolutely critical moment I had been preparing for, the moment everything would be decided. Pushing too hard would drive her straight back into his waiting arms. Saying nothing might mean losing her forever to his manipulation. "Before you decide," I said as carefully as I could manage, my heart hammering, "could we please finish our conversation about the future we once planned together? The one with that small cottage by the lake where we dreamed of spending our summers." Something profound softened in her eyes at the memory of dreams we had once shared so innocently, so hopefully. For one beautiful, aching moment, I glimpsed genuine uncertainty breaking through, the very first crack in the absolute, unquestioning conviction the master had so carefully, methodically instilled in her vulnerable mind. She slowly, deliberately set the phone down without responding to his summons. A small act of rebellion that felt monumental. "I remember," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "You were going to build a dock where we could watch the sunset together every evening." That evening transformed into a profound journey through our shared past, through everything we had been before this nightmare consumed us. We pulled out photo albums, running our fingers over captured moments of joy. We held mementos from trips where we'd been so blissfully, innocently happy. We shared inside jokes that somehow, miraculously, still made us both laugh despite everything that had been broken between us. We didn't discuss the center. We didn't debate its teachings. We simply reconnected with the deep, solid foundation of our relationship, the bedrock that existed before the spiritual detour had torn us apart. When she finally replied to the master's message, politely but firmly declining the emergency session, I felt a cautious, fragile hope blooming in my chest for the first time in what felt like years. It was her first direct refusal since joining the group. Her first act of true resistance. The barrage of texts that immediately followed, increasingly urgent and desperate appeals about her supposed spiritual endangerment, went completely unanswered as she deliberately silenced her phone and turned it face down on the table. A symbolic rejection. The next morning, while she was in the shower, her phone vibrated repeatedly, buzzing insistently against the nightstand. Against my better judgment, driven by protective instinct, I glanced at the screen. The messages from the master had taken a deeply disturbing, threatening turn. Your husband is energetically poisoning you. We've invested too much in your ascension to lose you now. Remember the significant financial commitments you've made to your spiritual future. That last message caught my attention like a hook sinking deep. What financial commitments? I had been carefully monitoring our joint accounts, and while there had definitely been concerning withdrawals for workshops and enlightenment materials, nothing had suggested a truly major financial entanglement of this magnitude. When she emerged from the bathroom, wrapped in a towel and looking vulnerable, I gently, non-confrontationally asked about these mysterious commitments. Her immediate reluctance to answer, the way her eyes dropped to the floor, told me absolutely everything I needed to know. After some painful hesitation, the truth finally came pouring out. She had secretly taken out a substantial personal loan for $25,000 as an ascension deposit, with promises she had made to contribute even more as her spiritual investment deepened. He says financial sacrifice is proof of genuine spiritual commitment, she explained, still unable to meet my eyes, shame coloring her voice. The money goes into a special fund for only the most advanced students to eventually establish a permanent spiritual retreat center. The revelation hit me like a physical blow, absolutely staggering. Beyond the obvious, horrifying financial manipulation, what truly wounded me was that such a monumentally significant decision had been made in complete secrecy, without even a whisper of discussion between us. This wasn't just about different spiritual beliefs anymore. This was about the foundational trust of our partnership being utterly violated and destroyed. I know it sounds really bad when I say it out loud, she admitted, her voice small and ashamed like a child confessing wrongdoing. But when you're there, physically present, surrounded by everyone else's absolute certainty and conviction, it somehow makes perfect sense. That moment of self-awareness, that crack in the facade, gave me desperate hope that the woman I loved was still somewhere inside, still fighting to break free. We spent the entire day just talking, really talking in a way we hadn't in over a year, about what had initially drawn her to the group and what deep emotional needs it had fulfilled that were perhaps missing in her life, in our marriage. For the first time, she acknowledged with painful honesty feeling directionless and lost after a devastating career setback 3 years ago. Precisely the vulnerable moment when she had first encountered the group. They had found her when she was wounded and susceptible. I felt special there, she confessed, her voice breaking. Chosen. Like I possessed unique spiritual gifts that only the master could recognize and nurture. You were special, I told her fiercely, taking her hands in mine. But not because someone appointed themselves the sole arbiter of your worth. You're special because of who you've always been. With or without anyone's validation. The week that followed was one of careful, painstaking rebuilding, like reconstructing something precious that had been shattered. She agreed to speak with a counselor who specialized in helping people escape high-control groups. Not to be deprogrammed, as she initially feared, but simply to gain objective perspective from someone who understood the psychological mechanisms at play. I attended one crucial session where the compassionate counselor helped me finally understand how intelligent, capable, successful people can be drawn into these devastating situations during vulnerable periods in their lives. It wasn't weakness. It was human vulnerability being ruthlessly exploited. Just as we seemed to be making genuine, meaningful progress, the master dramatically escalated his tactics, revealing his true nature. First came the concerned visits from other group members, appearing at our doorstep speaking ominously about her spiritual regression and the dangers she faced. Then came aggressive legal threats about the loan commitment she had signed, filled with intimidating language. Finally, a letter arrived addressing private, intimate details of supposedly confidential spiritual counseling sessions. Details that no legitimate, ethical spiritual advisor would ever disclose to anyone. Each transparent manipulation tactic spectacularly backfired, pushing her further and further from his toxic influence rather than drawing her back under his control. The woman I had married was naturally resourceful, intelligent, and strong. Once she finally began to recognize the manipulation for what it truly was, her natural, healthy skepticism powerfully reasserted itself. The final communication from the master came in the form of a voice message I happened to overhear, his voice dripping with venom and wounded ego. You're throwing away your spiritual destiny for a conventional life of pathetic limitation. When your marriage inevitably fails and crumbles, and it will fail, don't expect the community to welcome you back with open arms. That night, as we sat together on our back porch watching the sun paint the sky in brilliant colors, she made her final, irrevocable decision. She deliberately deleted the center's app from her phone and blocked the master's number completely, cutting off his access to her mind. I want to rebuild what we had, she said quietly, her voice trembling but determined. If you're still willing to try. If I haven't destroyed everything beyond repair. I took her hand, feeling genuine, powerful hope flooding through me for the first time in months. Always. I'm always willing to fight for us. The road stretching ahead wouldn't be easy. There was significant financial damage to address and repair. Trust had been shattered and needed to be painstakingly rebuilt, piece by piece. And she had her own difficult process of fully understanding and coming to terms with what had happened to her, how she had been manipulated and exploited. But for the first time in what felt like an eternity, we were facing these overwhelming challenges together, side by side, rather than from opposite sides of an unbridgeable ideological divide. What neither of us could have possibly anticipated was the master's absolute refusal to simply let go, and the truly terrifying lengths to which he would go to punish what he perceived as her ultimate betrayal. The nightmare wasn't over. In fact, it was about to get much, much worse. The retaliation began with calculated subtlety, like poison slowly spreading through our lives. First came carefully crafted emails to our extended family expressing supposed spiritual concern about her deteriorating mental state. Every word was meticulously chosen to sound like genuine, loving worry while simultaneously painting her as dangerously unstable and unreliable. Then, like clockwork, former friends from the center began systematically approaching her colleagues at work, spreading similar insidious insinuations about her professional reliability and mental competence. The master was methodically, vindicatively attacking her reputation and dismantling her support network piece by piece. These were classic, textbook isolation tactics I had read about extensively in my research. What he foolishly hadn't anticipated was our preparedness. The counselor had explicitly warned us about potential, likely backlash, and we had been quietly, meticulously documenting absolutely everything. The financial manipulation with detailed records. The inappropriate, boundary-crossing messages carefully screenshot and saved. The relentless pressure tactics thoroughly documented with dates and times. When a carefully crafted, professional-looking letter viciously questioning her professional competence arrived at her workplace, clearly designed to damage her career, we were completely ready. We responded with our own comprehensive documentation demonstrating beyond any doubt the coordinated harassment campaign being waged against her. The most shocking, violating escalation came exactly 3 weeks after she left the group. We returned home one evening to find our front door mysteriously unlocked, standing slightly ajar. Nothing obvious appeared to be stolen except her personal journal and several crucial financial documents. Gone. Vanished. The violation of our home, our sanctuary, was deeply, profoundly unsettling. But the police officer who responded to our frightened call seemed disturbingly unsurprised after hearing the background. These situations often get significantly worse before they get better, he advised grimly while methodically filing the report. Document everything obsessively. Install a comprehensive security camera system immediately. And seriously consider obtaining a restraining order if the harassment continues or escalates further. That night, as we installed new, stronger locks and urgently ordered a state-of-the-art security system, she finally opened up completely about her entire experience within the group. The full, unvarnished truth came pouring out. The manipulation had been so gradual, so expertly executed, she hadn't recognized it happening to her in real time. Spiritual teachings that initially seemed genuinely enlightening and positive had slowly, imperceptibly transformed into sophisticated control mechanisms. Questions were systematically discouraged and reframed as spiritual resistance. Doubts were manipulated and reframed as personal failings and weaknesses. Relationships outside the group were gradually cast as spiritually detrimental and dangerous to her progress. I gave him complete power over our marriage, she admitted, her voice breaking with shame and grief. I let him systematically convince me that disconnecting from you was spiritual growth rather than what it actually was, him methodically isolating me from the one person most likely to see through his manipulation and rescue me. The next morning brought the most direct, brazen attack yet. A threatening letter from an attorney representing the center demanding full repayment of the entire spiritual investment loan within 30 days, accompanied by thinly veiled threats about dragging us through humiliating, destructive public legal proceedings if we failed to immediately comply with their demands. The intimidation tactic was utterly transparent. They were threatening to drag us through embarrassing public litigation, destroying our reputations completely, unless she obediently returned to the fold like a prodigal daughter. Instead of responding directly and defensively, we immediately consulted our own attorney. His assessment was swift and devastating to their threats. The loan agreement, drawn up by the center itself rather than any legitimate financial institution, was absolutely riddled with blatantly unenforceable clauses and potential serious violations of consumer protection laws. Our lawyer's response was brief, professional, and utterly devastating. Any legal action whatsoever would immediately trigger our own comprehensive countersuit for systematic harassment, deliberate fraud, and operating an unlicensed financial institution in violation of state and federal laws. The threats stopped immediately. Complete silence. We didn't hear directly from the master or the center again, though we occasionally encountered former group members in public who would either avoid eye contact entirely, scurrying away like frightened animals, or approach us with carefully rehearsed, robotic recruitment pitches. Each unsettling encounter reinforced how terrifyingly close we had come to losing absolutely everything. Recovery wasn't linear or simple. Some days she seemed completely, gloriously free of the group's toxic influence, her old self shining through brilliantly. Other days I would find her sitting alone, quietly questioning herself, momentarily vulnerable once again to the insidious doubts the master had so carefully, methodically cultivated in her mind. The counselor gently assured us this was completely normal and expected. Deprogramming from deeply embedded thought patterns takes substantial time, she explained patiently. Especially when they've been wrapped in the seductive language of spiritual growth and enlightenment. 6 long months after her courageous decision to leave the group, we attended a support meeting for former members and their traumatized families. Hearing others share nearly identical experiences was simultaneously validating and deeply disturbing. The exact same recruitment approaches. The identical isolation tactics. Even the same specific spiritual terminology used to justify financial exploitation and emotional abuse. The master had been running this same playbook for years, leaving behind him a devastating trail of broken marriages, drained bank accounts, and shattered lives. During the quiet drive home from that emotionally intense meeting, she turned to me with tears streaming down her face, glistening in the passing streetlights. "I need to say something I should have said months ago," she said, her voice thick with emotion and regret. "I'm so sorry. Not just for what happened with the group, but for how I treated you. Dismissing your valid concerns. Belittling your perspective. Threatening our sacred marriage over teachings that never truly resonated with my actual soul. I was desperately looking for meaning and purpose, and I got manipulated and exploited. But that doesn't excuse how badly I hurt you." I reached across the console, finding her hand and gripping it tightly. "We both made mistakes," I said honestly. "I saw the changes happening right before my eyes and didn't intervene effectively early enough. I'm just eternally grateful we found our way back to each other before irreparable damage was done." "Some damage was done," she said quietly, painfully. "To our trust. To our finances. To our intimacy. To everything we built. Do you really, truly think we can rebuild completely? Can we ever get back what we lost?" That heartbreaking question hung heavily between us as we pulled into our driveway. The home we had shared for so many years looked different now, transformed. A place where we had both experienced such profound pain and betrayal, but also, miraculously, where genuine healing had finally begun. As we walked slowly to the front door, I considered her devastating question with the seriousness it deserved. "I don't think we rebuild what was," I finally answered with hard-won wisdom. "I think we build something entirely new. Something even stronger than before, because we now understand how fragile and precious connections can be when we take them for granted. When we stop fighting for them." That night, for the first time in nearly a full year, we slept in the same bed together. Not resuming physical intimacy immediately, but simply sharing sacred space as we began the delicate, vulnerable process of reconnection. There would be many more challenges ahead, obstacles we couldn't yet foresee. Her ongoing psychological recovery from trauma. Rebuilding our decimated financial stability from the ground up. Addressing the genuine, legitimate spiritual questions that had made her vulnerable to manipulation in the first place. Questions that still deserved real answers. But for the first time, I was absolutely confident we would face these challenges together, united as partners once more. The spiritual path she had been sold was nothing but a manufactured, predatory route to someone else's enrichment and ego gratification. The path we were consciously choosing now, of painful honesty, mutual growth through adversity, and hard-earned wisdom purchased with tears and struggle, that was the genuine spiritual journey. Not one of calculated isolation and systematic exploitation disguised as enlightenment, but of authentic connection built on an unshakable foundation of truth, mutual respect, and love that had been tested by fire and emerged stronger. It was a path we would walk together from this moment forward, eyes wide open, supporting each other through whatever challenges lay ahead. Together. Always together.